Thank you for the opportunity to interview you.
My
Um,
pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Tell people in a story or two a little bit about yourself and what led you to discover or to invent so much. What's make a
Well, that's
method
that's no that's
useful?
no easy task because there's a lot of work that's involved here. How do you get this started? The first thing you've got to do is go and say hello to the person to whom you're going to be taking inspiration from. So that helps, as opposed to I'm just going to steal all of their work and copy it, which is what happens a lot. An awful lot of what passes as modeling in the NLP world is actually little more than plagiarism. But change a few words here and there and call it modeling, and somehow people find that acceptable. What we've got to do, of course, is test stuff. And one of the things is testing it in our own imagination is only a beginning. We've got to test it with other people, take feedback, monitor for variability. For example, take 200 people, split them into two groups, work with 100 people using this particular variable, then work with 100 people using this particular variable. And now let's compare and contrast the differences across groups and so on. This is the kind of stuff that I do. There's a lot of work involved in this kind of stuff. I think a problem that too many people have is they think it should be quite straightforward and easy. That if I can think something up, I'm going to be born clever, and I've done some clever courses, therefore it must become very, very easy. Too many people are locked into that mindset and they forget that actually it's hard work. In the coaching world and personal development world, there's a very common thing, which is if it feels like hard work, you're doing it wrong because this stuff is like magic. Yeah, that's good marketing. So essentially, you've got to find really competent people. You've got to find out what they do and have a look at what they do, and then start to consider what else could they do they haven't thought of. That would be a good start. Or people could actually try and be original. There's another one. Not so easy, because quite often we try originality, and actually what we're doing is reinventing something already been invented. So yeah, it's all part of the assessment, review, and finding out.
Okay, talk a little bit about stuff that was already invented, because in a way, in your work, there is some relation to mysticism, to magic, to spirituality. What is the connection that you see? What did you discover on that regard?
Okay. So humans have been noticing symbolism and creating symbolism and working with symbolism since I think there has ever been humans. Now, do other species do this? Wouldn't surprise me at all. Whether we recognize it is a different matter. So, one of my primary interests is in things like comparative religion, the archetypes that exist. So, these recurring stories, motifs, and symbols that exist across cultures, across context, and across huge spans of time, where similar features and motifs emerge within the stories that people tell. Now, some of those stories, because they are so universal to that particular culture, become enshrined in their religion. Now, within those religions, you're going to find mystical practices. Now, what the mystical practices are largely entailing, whether it's mysticism, meditation, magic, occultism, whichever variation it takes, it's the manipulation of symbols in conjunction with other symbols. So a lot of the magic stuff is people manipulating symbols to derive experience and meaning from them in different ways in different contexts. Now, most religions, everything from the ancient Aborigine to ancient India to the South Americas, people have been doing this forever. There's something inherently human about it. In order to understand what people are doing today through language, through their psychological representation and stuff, through their dreams and through their ambitions and actual dreams, there's all sorts of stuff that people do. If we want to understand that in depth, we need to understand the origins of where all that comes from. It comes from our language, it comes from the stories, it comes from our narratives, our world religions. Because we learn the lexicon of the language from our families, from our parents, from our communities, who learnt it from the people before them, who learnt it from the people before them. It goes all the way back. And so, if we really want to understand people's metaphor and symbolism and what that all means, I think a really in depth study of history, of religion, of mysticism and magic is very important. Now, my own personal preference is the Jewish Kabbalah in the Western magical form, simply because in the, we'll say, the late 1800s, beginnings of the 1900s, the symbolism there was systematized by some of the Western magical orders, which basically makes it much more available, much easier to comprehend. So that's really where my studies began.
And if we're taking that to practicality, like how can you take that study to a daily practice or to like what do you do with it?
Well, what other people will do with it, I couldn't tell you. Because
I'm
now
asking what
what I
do.
do with it is lots of study. Now, for those, I mean, those are familiar with my background, I'm a member of a number of magical orders. So there's lots of lodge work, practical work. Obviously, can't tell you about that. That would require secrecy and breaches, so I can't do that. But there's lots of books written on this sort of stuff. There's a lot of information out there for people to want to learn. But here's the thing: there's no one thing. So what works for me isn't the way to do it. That's just the way I do it. I think people have to find their own thing, whether they are making a study of Judaism or Christianity or the Aztecs, and they find a particular thing that resonates with them. And so that's the path they go down. Great. There's a lot of flavor, or a lot of different flavors for people to find the one they like the most.
How do you how we say it? You spoke about a lot of varieties of way of working that you are a part of. And I'm very curious how can someone distinguish between good or bad in that regard? Like one side of that work and maybe the human potential movement and all of that is to try to be better, influence, um, manipulating reality or using symbols to impact our reality or our perception of reality. And the other side of it could be like uh, flowing with everything and accepting. How can we find the right balance between those two?
Well, I think a key thing is people need to be very, very suspicious of anybody who is presenting themselves as some form of guru, any form of expert, and so on. The personal development field, especially, as well as the world religion, meditation, essentially, I will say, show me one of these gurus, whether a meditation teacher, a wellness guru, and so forth. I'll show you a narcissist with a very high degree of probability. We have to remind that these fields are overrun by people with very high narcissistic intent. What they're able to do is find a subjective field, so they can't be measured objectively. You don't find that many chemists who are highly narcissistic because that involves lab work largely solo, where everything can be objectively measured. But in the field of personal development, the field of religion, the field of mysticism and occultism, everything is subjective. There is no objective measurement. It is therefore the perfect hunting ground for narcissists seeking narcissistic supply. They find their audience, they get lots of attention, they get to present themselves as the great master. So there's a lot of that goes on. So my recommendation to anyone, have a default setting. Assume the person you're looking at is a narcissist or somebody with very high narcissistic intent until proven otherwise. And generally, that will take you a long way. There's a lot of people out there who are scamming. There's a lot of people preying on the needy and the desperate Just assume you don't know you are the needy and the desperate and you're being preyed upon. Start from that position, and then go from there. And you have to shop around. There's a lot of really good people out there. There's a lot of really good authoritative text and groups all over the place. It's just that they are the minority.
Yeah, the minority. Okay. What lead you to discover and to do the work of eye movement therapy, and what are the, I want to ask about the mechanism that work behind it.
Well, so for the integral eye movement therapy, we have to bear in mind there was no one single thing. This didn't just emerge in a day. This was something that was developed over a long period of time. As I learned more, as I got feedback from the experimentations that I was doing with groups and general feedback from people I was working with. So it's an evolutional process. There's no one particular thing. But essentially, it comes down to we have EMDR is always already established. I was aware of eye movements and EMDR, so I had some rudimentary understanding and started experimenting with that. What I found was when that worked, it was like a miracle. It would work quickly and incredibly effectively for some people. And then for other people I was working with, no benefit whatsoever. And yet the presenting problems seem to be very, very similar. So I wanted to find out why does it not work when in to all indicators it should work. So I started to ask the questions, what variables need to be introduced in order to get something to work when it previously wasn't? That was now the beginnings of what became IEMT. Now, within that, of course, I then have those people for whom eye movement work is never going to work. It doesn't matter what variations we bring to it. So in which case, okay, what is the criteria? What do they have in common that's different for the people for whom it does work? And now we begin to have this diagnostic framework, this criteria by which to measure what work do we do with what person. One of the problems that I found with things like EMDR, in fact, any of the alphabet therapies, because they have the individual practitioner has invested in that particular approach, that's what they do with everyone that comes through the door. Well, that's not necessary. So the homeopath will do homeopathy. The EMDR person will do EMDR. The CBT person does CBT. The same person with the same problem could go to 10 different disciplined therapists and be given 10 different therapies. Well, surely that makes no sense. Yet to each individual practitioner, to them, they are making sense, but it doesn't, because we have to structure what we're doing around that particular individual. So individuals present variables. And then what starts to happen is as I document and as I'm learning more over time, I learn the different variables, therefore create different processes. So that's the easiest way. That's the only really quick way I can explain that without going into chapter and verse and would be here for weeks.
Yeah.
And I don't think you want that.
Maybe I want that, but I'm not sure the audience right now want that. It's
I can sell you a very expensive training course you can come on.
yeah, that's amazing. Um, so you spoke a little bit about the structure of metaphors or metaphors that coming up through mysticism. I'm curious if there is some, everybody familiar with the hero journey, or but what's coming up like categorically, or archetypes of metaphors that keep coming up from people.
Well, without teaching what all the archetypes are and your audience, I can't answer that question because it won't make sense. Because what most people are familiar with when it comes to metaphor in therapy, the majority of people will be familiar with the NLP type metaphor, isomorphic, homomorphic, polymorphic metaphor. Most people are reasonably familiar with that, even if they don't actually utilize those processes. And I've got to say, there are some very good books written on that. They might be familiar with the Milton Erickson type metaphor. Hopefully, if they've been around for a while, they ought to be, if they're not, they ought to be familiar with James Lawley and Penny Tompkins' work around clean language, which is a very different model for exploring metaphor work. And like, just if you haven't heard of it, don't know what that is, this is to your audience, go and study that. It's absolutely well worth. It'll be well worth your time. Let's just and their resources. While I'm on the thing, their resources on their website. Fantastic, clean language. Do that. And then we've got things like the hero's journey, which you mentioned, which is what a lot of people are familiar with. Well, the framework that I'm doing is none of those things, nor is it an extension of any of those things. The area of metaphor we're working with is autogenic metaphor. These are the components of experience that are revealed through idiomatic communications. The idioms we use, like I'm feeling stuck, I'm trapped, I'm on an uphill struggle, I'm weighed down. These are idioms that people use that denote an autogenic metaphorical experience. These are the things in the work that I developed that we are basically cataloging, categorizing, and then able to work with once you understand those categories.
So,
So it is quite different to what people will be familiar with.
because it's thinking about it from a process perspective instead of narrow it down to a detailed, or and try to figure
Well,
out what is the difference.
I remember when I was younger, especially as a student, it was quite popular, these dream diaries or dream thing. You look, I dream a fish, and then you look up what a fish means. I dream of a long road. You look up what the long road means. I think this is what a lot of people will be having consideration. That's definitely got nothing to do with anything we do. So it is largely process orientated, but it is largely about how the two hemispheres of the brain are interacting with each other. Under certain conditions, the symbolism of the right hemisphere projects into three-dimensional space. And that is why autogenic metaphor is proprioceptive, because we elicit the metaphor because the person is in the middle of their experience, which is represented metaphorically. That's the right hemisphere projecting into three-dimensional space. And the guy sitting in the middle of that is left hemisphere. Now, what we're able to do, but is in this work, we're looking at how those two hemispheres are relating to each other. For example, a person has a brick wall in front of them. Their problem is, I'm bashing my head against a brick wall. Well, that's not a good relationship to have. If the bashing the head is left hemisphere and brick wall is right hemisphere, that's not a good relationship. So we might invite them to potentially change their approach. That's the basis of the work that we do.
Wow.
So we're creating better harmony and integration in terms of internal mapping of experience.
Did you ever did a brain imaging or EEG to
If I
study?
had enough money, and for these kind of studies, and rather a lot of it,
Yeah,
I ought to go into that spiritual business. I could be a lot richer. If I had enough money, yeah, there'd be imaging studies. No, we haven't.
yeah. Oh, wow.
However, if there's anyone out there listening who has a free MRI scanner, well, functional MRI scanner,
I'm coming.
and all the rest, positron emission topography would be good as well. If anyone's got one of those, yeah, get in touch.
Yeah. I have used to the QEEG device to measure we can play, but um, trauma. You in the field of doing processes with people for a long time. I bet you met a lot of people and did a lot of processes. Do you have stories and insight about the mechanism about how trauma work in people?
I'm sorry, are you saying karma?
Trauma.
K-A-R
You can answer about karma also. It's interesting also, but trauma, I think
trauma.
that's what I
Okay.
ask.
What about it? Sorry, now you have
If
to
you
repeat the
have
question to me.
any insight or story about the mechanism that people build or experience trauma and then how to eliminate it, or
Well, to be honest, I think the trauma industry, trauma has become a big therapeutic industry. Everyone's an expert on trauma these days. And we now have more variations. We now have post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress injury, complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
now it's become
And it's just
complex.
just ever new things, which is basically awful things happen to people. And those awful things have two things to them. The awful things are measure can be huge or small, so they're huge variation, but we also now have the subjective response. So, for example, big trauma happens to a normal person, it's awful. Small trauma happens to normal person, might not be so awful. However, normal person might be extremely sensitive to components of that experience, and they're more messed up than big trauma. So there's a non-linear relationship between event and response and activity that happens inside people. Now, so we can't measure trauma by the event. We can only measure trauma by the response. The problem we have is the entire industry of trauma has now taught everyone to be highly, highly sensitive and to find trauma where previously people wouldn't have found it. So now we have a problem. To what degree is a person's traumatic response their own? And to what degree is it culturally defined and created? I'm not suggesting or negating the trauma to be less than it is experienced. If a person's experiencing trauma, that's what they experience. The question I have is, was it created by the trauma or the cultural paradigm in which it's experienced? And this is an area the trauma industry is creating with total ignorance of the fact they're creating it. So it's a problem that in a short conversation, I can't really give you the answers to. But I would urge all therapists just to back off a little bit. The endless podcasts like this talking about trauma, the endless websites about trauma, the marketing of trauma absolutely everywhere. We end up now with a generation of children who are now learning that everything is traumatic. They live in a traumatic world and everything is scary. The default position of children now is no longer boredom. The default position of children is anxiety. Oh, and that must be because of the traumatic experiences they have as children, because children are so traumatic. And it just goes on. So, in order to answer any question about trauma, we first of all now have to define what trauma is. And that in itself is going to take a philosophy department at a university a long time to agree terms on because of the amount of nuance and variability. So, you asked me a question about do I have any insight on how we treat trauma? No, because I don't know what anyone means when they talk about trauma. I only know what an individual means when they talk about trauma, because what they're referring to might not be related to what anyone else is referring to. Because one word is not objective against experience. These things are too subjective.
But we can say it about everything, like in a
Correct.
way, and that's I think you discovered like a cultural problem with language in general,
Hmm.
because every language is some form of generalization, and every it could be trauma, it could be every other problem that we will talk about.
Correct.
And
100%. I completely agree with you.
I have two questions regarding that. First of all, is there is any way to not be caught up on that trap of language while doing processes?
Yeah, I would recommend everyone actually studies linguistics. Here's what I used to say to people. If you're going to be a therapist or coach, you're going to use language to influence the brain of another person. Therefore, I would expect every coach or any influencer to have an expertise in linguistics and an expertise in neurology. Since the tools you're using is words to affect another person's brain. And they are often the two things that people don't study. And then, of course, we're into all the philosophy, the ethics, and all the rest of it. So it gets complex. But people want this, especially the NLPers. I can learn all of this in 7 days, an accelerated 7 day practitioner, and I'm better than everyone else on the planet. Mm. That's why they don't like me very much.
How can that get incorporated in the work? Like you discover the problem. The problem people one language is different than other language, and even what you said to figure it out what's keep coming back between different culture, then it's a sign of something that could be a fractal of true in a way. When you are in a spiritual practice, whatever spiritual practice it is, did you find it more effective without a language, or it need to be an accurate language? How
No,
can
your language needs to
someone
have
not even
precision.
understand it, but can start to go about it?
Not really understanding your question, but essentially, what do people? What do I think people need to do? Got to put some work in. Ultimately, there's a lot of if we are going to understand metaphor, therapy, change work, all those kind of things, then what we need to be able to do is operate with precision. Now, in order to operate with precision, we have to come out of operating from a position of feeling and belief. You only have to look on any of the coaching forums, therapy forums, hypnosis forums, NLP forums, all of them, where someone will go, I've got a client coming to see me with this particular problem. What shall I do? And then what we start to see is a huge an array of answers with everyone suggesting what technique should be used. Now, they know nothing about the human being with the problem. They've never met them. They've probably never spoken or met the therapist. And yet they already know what technique is going to work for that particular client. Now, this is faith based practice. This is not therapy. This is not precision. This is not even psychology. It's faith. This is no different to going, my Aunt Jeannie has got cancer. Which saint should I pray to? And then people go, you should pray to Saint Joseph. You should pray to Saint, right? That's faith-based practice. We see exactly the same thing in the world of therapy and coaching, especially amongst the alphabet therapists, and especially on those forums.
I asked about what is the process or what is the skills that the person need to develop, and you say language. The next
Yeah, and
question is
language and precision.
and precision. So the next question is how. I'm get the frame of thinking that language is important, neurology is important, precision is important. I'm
Now
kind of
you're asking
asking
me
how.
how. Okay, you're asking me how.
Yeah.
Give me a context by which you mean the word how. Because are you asking me for a technique?
No, for a direction, for a course of recommendation,
Oh, I should come up with some more expensive courses. I think a good
I will come.
start is reading some books. I think some of the classics, you know. So we've got the classics in terms of philosophy. There's lots of those. I mean, it'll probably make everyone, if you start reading those, you start smoking and drinking too much. It's probably helpful when studying philosophy. So philosophy is a really good place to start. Neurology is a good place to start. Now, I'm not talking your Facebook neurology. I'm talking proper neuroscience books, the stuff that doctors study, things like that. Now, here's the reality. For most people, when they're encountering this sort of material for the first time, they will look at a page and there'll be loads of words in there that they do not understand what they mean. They have no clue, and therefore it's very hard to understand what's being written. Well, these days that makes life is easy because what you now do is you look up each of those words and study those things. Then once you understand what all those words mean, come back and read that page again. And then you go to your next page and repeat. There's a big difference between studying a text and reading it. And one of the things I think people forget to do once they've left their full-time education when they're younger, they forget to study. They read things or read through things and hope that somehow inspiration happens. What tends to happen, and this is purely my own extremely biased and extremely subjective belief, is they're reading through it looking for a feeling or a belief or something that validates something they already know, and that one takeaway from an entire book. Study is where it's at, and lots of it. Like I have to say again, there is so much more work than most people are willing to put in. But if people put the work in, the results will speak for themselves, both in their personal life, in their business, and in their client benefits.
So the willingness to put up the work that's necessary for that to happen, and the ability to go back and to make sure that they are not coming with a presupposition of I will take that from it basis on what reassure me or a feeling, then something that I can take and practice. The last question I want to ask you is there is anything that you would advise yourself in the start of the road? Someone in the start.
For anyone working in the people helping skills, there is one thing I would recommend everyone does. This is something I've been saying for years. Go and get part-time work or volunteer work in a teaching hospital and do that for a long time. There's a number of features that will happen here. You'll start meeting people who are far more educated and trained in all sorts of interesting things you've never heard of. And so you'll start to mix with generally hospitals by their definition have the higher IQ, higher qualified individuals that tend to work in them. So you're going to start to mix with very educated people. That's a really good place to be. You're also going to learn stuff just by osmosis, just from being in those environments. But more importantly, people start to get a perspective of standards. What I see, what would be acceptable in a hospital care environment in terms of professional expectation, and what is a expected standard within something like, say, hypnotherapy and NLP, they are worlds apart. I'm often shocked by how, and I don't wish this to be insulting to anybody because it's not how it's intended, but how utterly dumbed down so much of what passes for training actually is. And people are encountering this dumbed down training, and for them, it's groundbreaking, it's incredible, it's genius. And yet, if that same training course were presented to healthcare professionals in a hospital setting, at least in any of the departments I worked in, they would be laughed out of the room. They are worlds apart. And this is my one despair about the what I call the alphabet therapies, is that what people expect, people's version of what passes for genius, and what I came from in terms of my time in healthcare, they are so far apart from each other, so different. And I would love to see a much more intelligent approach developed within the alphabet therapies. So this is why I recommend people go and work in hospitals, part-time or volunteering. Every large hospital has an army of volunteers, and they are invaluable to the hospital. They really are. So it's valuable stuff they're doing, even if they're just serving tea in the tea shop. That that in itself is massive in terms of, but they will start to experience a different reality, and I would hope start to have a different level of expectation for what is possible.
There is a way, I'm asking for a field perspective, but like to organize good in that regard, because you're saying if people will put more hours in right places with the right standard, but what is the resistance to what are the big resistance in fields, in professional fields to do that? Because I'm experienced similar things in the horses field, as example, therapy with horses, which I'm part of. And I try to think if there is a way of globally change it, or what is the difficulty on that regard, if it's ego, if it's...
I've absolutely no idea.
intelligence?
There's probably as many reasons as there are people. Um, but generally, I think people are not proactive enough. They people we don't raise children to be proactive, to be questioning everything, and to just go ahead and go for it. We teach children to wait, do as they're told, and be obedient. And I think that is good when you're trying to keep control of a group of children. But if you're one of those children who's internalized that and now you're 40 and you're still being obedient and fitting in and don't be proactive and don't make a fuss, that may not be serving the adults so well. And I think a lot of people are too passive or too reactive. They're not proactive enough. And I've learned over the years I'm not a good motivator of people. I don't know if people can be motivated. I think it has to come from within them. But I might be wrong. It's not my area at all. I can't speak of any authority there at all.
But you said a lot about like start with the young or start with whatever needs to be corrected that was messed up when they were young. So that's an answer, a good answer.
Yeah, well, good luck. Good luck with that.
We can only do what we do. That's and in our own small garden, it doesn't have to be like
Hmm.
yeah. Thank you. It was for me an amazing experience to interview you. Thank you for your
Thank you,
time
Omer.
and all of that amazing knowledge.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.